On the 23rd of August 1939, around 85 years ago, the Third Reich, as represented by Joachim von Ribbentrop, and the Soviet Union, as represented by Vyacheslav Molotov, signed a secret agreement that would later be known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Now, on its face, this was an agreement that sought to establish a period of non-aggression between the Third Reich and the Soviet Union. But what is most important is that it was a secret pact, or at least there was a protocol within the agreement that was a secret protocol which established Soviet and German spheres of influence across Europe, specifically Eastern Europe. According to this secret protocol, Poland would be split between the two nations and shared, while Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland would go to the Soviet Union upon their territorial expansion. A week later, on the 1st of September 1939, the Third Reich would officially invade Poland, starting the beginning of the Second World War in Europe. A couple of weeks later, on the 17th of September 1939, one day after the approval of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact by the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union, we see that Stalin invades Poland. Now, Stalin's justification for the invasion and the carving up of Poland is based on concerns for ethnic Ukrainians and Belarusians in Poland. Now, today, in the modern era, from 2022 onwards, we can see in many ways that there are similarities between what is taking place right now and what we saw at the beginning of the Second World War. And this is especially in thinking about the past few years in Ukraine, and most importantly, and quite interestingly, the past few days. So thinking from the past few years, just like Stalin's claim of protecting ethnic Ukrainians in Poland, the motivation for the start of the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was based on claims that Russian-speaking peoples were being subjected to a genocide in the Donbass region, a claim that has been utterly rejected by the majority of the international community, including the International Court of Justice. For a citation, see the genocide case between Russia and Ukraine. The provisional measures therein, indicated by the ICJ, make it very clear that not only was the aggression on the part of the Russian Federation unlawful, but that those claims of genocide were utterly rejected as having no evidentiary basis by the ICJ. Skipping ahead then to this week, it seems very clear that the echoes of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact are repeating, with the current negotiations that are taking place in Saudi Arabia for peace settlements, including negotiations between the United States under the Trump administration, the Russian Federation, and most importantly, not Ukraine. In the illustrious words of historian Timothy Snyder, a few days ago on the 17th of February 2025, just prior to the start of these negotiations, it was said, quote, "Tomorrow in Ukraine, Russian soldiers will attack Ukrainians. Russian drones and bombs and rockets will target Ukrainian homes. A criminal war of aggression will continue. Tomorrow in Saudi Arabia, Russian officials will discuss the future of Ukraine with a handful of Americans, delegated by a president who sympathizes with the Russian view of the war. The Russians will have the luxury of talking about Ukraine without the presence of Ukrainians." It is that final line that is so striking to me, because what this clearly shows is that, just like with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, we can see that major powers are thinking about how they can best carve up a sovereign country, a sovereign democratic country that has, since 2022, and even, in fact, since 2014, been fighting for its independence against an aggressive and imperial neighbour. You wouldn't be surprised, then, to think that This move, in my belief, is utterly barbaric. It is a position we find ourselves in partially as the result of Russian disinformation campaigns, which have delegitimized the state and the people of Ukraine and induced a sense of sympathy in some of the right-wing populist politicians that we see in the West. It is not just the Trump administration. Populism in the right and to a lesser extent to the left, across all of Europe and across most of the West, have had a strong anti-Ukrainian and a strong pro-Russian sentiment attached to them. The Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, has consistently and repeatedly made claims that signal an anti-Ukrainian sentiment and a pro-Russian sentiment. Just the other day, in fact, just yesterday, I believe it was, Trump said that it is Ukraine's fault for this war taking place. Now, suggesting that they could have negotiated a peace settlement years ago, all of which undermining the territorial integrity, the sovereignty, and the security of this state. And so, really, I didn't want to make another episode of this Jus Gentium podcast today. In fact, I was planning on making another episode maybe next week, probably talking about Russia and Ukraine, but probably talking about Russia and Ukraine in a more abstract kind of way, maybe thinking more about international legal implications therein. Ultimately, there's very little international law associated with this episode. It is just more thinking about the geopolitics of what has been taking place over the last few days, as we've seen the Trump administration attempt to try and secure a peace settlement in Russia and Ukraine, but to do so at the detriment of Ukrainians. To be very, very clear then, the only fault of the war in Ukraine, the only state that is at fault for there being a war in Ukraine, is the Russian Federation. Russia unlawfully, without justification, in an act of aggression, set about a war of territorial expansion in a neighbouring sovereign country, in a sense of imperial expansionism that has been taking place ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in fact took place during the Soviet Union as well. Think about, for example, Afghanistan in the 1970s. Russian soldiers have shown a complete disregard for Ukrainian lives, leading to potentially tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people who have been killed. And so this is the point that needs to be very much stated right now. And populists on the left and on the right have consistently undermined this point, speaking instead about the idea of proxy wars between the US and the Russian Federation, or thinking about the idea of NATO expansion and all of these different claims. I want to make it very, very clear that NATO expansion, whatever that's supposed to mean, or the United States, or the West, all of these things have nothing to do with the start of this war. Russian aggression against its neighbours long predates the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe. The expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe takes place roughly in or around post-1999. Prior to 1999, the Russian Federation had invaded and had launched aggressive conflicts in places like Georgia, for example. It is actually the converse that is the case. Such Russian aggression against its neighbours in Georgia, in Chechnya, in Moldova, in Georgia again in 2008, in Transnistria, in Crimea in 2014, and now in Ukraine in 2022, all of these aggressive acts and expansionist and imperialist acts have been the primary driving factor to Eastern Europeans seeing and viewing NATO membership in a favourable light. There is no country that is to blame for NATO expansion more than the Russian Federation, giving these Eastern European states a reason to want to join a nuclear umbrella like that of NATO. And so this idea of being provoked by NATO expansion is a claim that has no basis in reality. If NATO expansion truly was the reason and the rationale for why the Russian Federation is acting in an aggressive way, why not attack countries that are on the path to joining NATO? Ukraine and Georgia are two countries that have barely had any kind of indication that they would ever be able to join NATO. In fact, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has accelerated the ways in which the Ukrainian state has now becoming more and more integrated into the Western European political order, with membership to the European Union, for example, being one such example of how that has taken place. Additionally, Russia and Russian aggression has led to a number of other states joining NATO as the result of this particular act. Finland, for example, and Sweden being two examples of NATO members that have taken place post the invasion in 2022. All of these facts need to be made very, very clear, because Russian disinformation and pro-Russian advocates, people who support the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine, would likely want to tell you a more complicated picture, or a difficult picture, or a different picture, thinking about the meddling in elections of the US, or the influence of the United States and the West in different revolutions, such as that of Euromaidan, and all of these different kinds of things. One day I will go into the Russo-Ukrainian war in more detail, maybe even in a series of lessons thinking about the sort of geopolitical implications, similar to the Israel-Palestine lessons that I'm doing at the moment. But for now, I just want to make it very, very clear that these are not true claims. Claims about NATO expansion, claims about the United States are not the reason for Russian aggression against its neighbor. And if you want to know that more clearly than anything, then you should just think about the actual words of the leaders who instigated these aggressive acts. When Putin went to invade Ukraine, he wasn't writing about NATO expansion. He was writing about, in a number of essays that are ascribed to him, the, quote, historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, trying to draw a line of lineage all the way back to a Viking by the name of Rurik, as a way to try and justify why Russians and Ukrainians are the same, and why Russia should be able to control Ukraine. He wasn't talking in that essay about NATO expansion. In his justification for why the Russian Federation decided to invade Ukraine, he wasn't talking about NATO expansion. He was talking about alleged and false claims of genocide and protecting Russian-speaking peoples. He was talking about claims of Ukrainians allegedly being far-right and members of Nazi organizations. So just bear that in mind when thinking about this conflict in more detail. And I want to just finish now by thinking about the end game of this particular conflict. There are a number of factors that need to be considered when thinking about an end game to this conflict, and thinking about the ways in which the Trump administration have gone about so far the bringing about to an end of this conflict. And the first point I want to make is that any treaty which hands over Ukrainian sovereignty or resources to the United States and the Russian Federation could only be achieved through the coercion of Ukrainians. The past few years have taught us that Ukrainian national identity is particularly strong, despite what Russian disinformation would have you believe. And so the result of any such agreement would be that it would require coercion, or it would require the use or threat of force. All of this would result in an agreement that is void in international law. Specifically Article 52 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which both the Russian Federation and the state of Ukraine are a party to, and which also represents customary international law, says, quote, "A treaty is void if its conclusion has been procured by the threat or use of force in violation of the principles of international law embodied in the Charter of the United Nations." This is a provision that would include the acquisition of territory by the use of force and the unlawful threat or use of force in contravention of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. For reference, the UN Charter Article 2.4 says, quote, "All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations." The Russian invasion of Ukraine and the acquisition of territory therein has all been in contravention and violation of this basic provision of the UN Charter. There has been no justification, there has been no reason for why the Russian Federation has been lawfully able to take territory in Ukraine and lawfully able to use force against Ukrainians and against the Ukraine as a state. There has been no rationale or justification for that. Anybody who studies international law and the use of force will know what the rationales and the justifications are for the use of force, things like self-defense, for example, or collective security, or the sort of under the auspices of UN Security Council authorization. None of these things have been met as standards for this use of force. So all of those things need to be made very, very clear at this point. The second point is less of a legal point, but is more of a geopolitical point. And the few ones that I'm going to focus on at the end here are all geopolitical conclusions that need to be drawn. The second point is that any deal which cedes territory from the Ukrainian state should require security guarantees. This is the most important point, and it is one that President Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has made very, very clear in his suggestions. The idea that Ukraine will be able to take back all of the southeastern region of Ukraine, the Donbass, the places of Donetsk and Luhansk, for example, or even Crimea, since it's been occupied since 2014, is quite unrealistic. If we're thinking in the sort of realm of realpolitik, we're thinking in the sort of realm of pragmatic application of good decision making, we might come to the conclusion that the Russian Federation, at the very least, is able to take the territory that it has at the moment. Now, this has been a very interesting point that Zelensky has made and shifted on ever so slightly, in the sense that what Zelensky is now saying is that if there is an agreement to be made which might cede territory to the Russian Federation, this has to come with security guarantees. Okay, in my opinion, these security guarantees should be nothing short of NATO membership. Membership to NATO has shown to work in preventing the Russian Federation from asserting aggressive action, as we can see in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. There has not been Russian aggression against these countries, and that's because Russian aggression against NATO members would trigger Article 5. Article 5 of NATO is very, very clear that an attack on one is an attack on all, and would essentially require from NATO members a collective response in defense of those territories. That's why NATO is so powerful, because NATO not only brings with it the nuclear umbrella, i.e. it prevents other states that are part of NATO from needing to acquire nuclear weapons because they are under the nuclear umbrella, such that where they're attacked, there are nuclear powers that are able to defend them under Article 5. But just Article 5 in and of itself provides that NATO as a collective security alliance is able to defend these smaller countries against the aggression of larger states as part of this NATO umbrella. Additionally, NATO membership is clearly something supported by more members of Europe, as we have seen with the addition of Finland and Sweden since the Russian invasion in 2022. And then finally, NATO membership should not be something that the Russian Federation gets to decide. It shouldn't be something that the West gets to decide either, by the way, because as a democratic state, Ukraine should have the full and free decision to join an alliance, an international alliance, without interference from third-party aggressive states. The fact that the whole events taking place in 2014 with the Euromaidan and the resignation of Viktor Yanukovych all came as a result of the fact that it seemed to be the case that the Ukrainian state was looking to align itself more with a free association agreement with the European Union rather than with a free trade agreement with the Russian Federation, shows very clearly that the Russian Federation has problems with the fact that Ukraine as a democratic state wants to align itself more with the West than it does with them. Ultimately, that is a decision for Ukraine and a decision for Ukrainians, because if we are all about sovereignty, Okay, and as these sort of right-wing populists in the UK at least has told us over the last sort of 10 or so years, especially with reference to things like Brexit and the European Union, apparently sovereignty is something that is very, very important to these people. Well, if that is the case, then we should be respecting the sovereignty of the Ukrainian state, the sovereignty of Ukraine, and allowing Ukraine as a democratic state to vote to decide on whether or not to join the European Union or whether or not to join NATO. And as you can probably imagine, membership to NATO as an idea is very popular in Ukraine right now. Its popularity spiked post 2014 with the invasion of Crimea by the Russian Federation, and I've at the time of recording haven't looked at the polling right now, but I imagine is still very, very, very high in Ukraine. In fact, desirability towards NATO and positivity towards NATO is ridiculously high across all of Eastern Europe, except for the major exception of Belarus, which of course is a borderline Russian puppet vassal state anyway. The third point doesn't necessarily reference Ukraine, but references a point that needs to be made about the relationship between the US and Europe in a sort of post-Trump era, in a period of time in which the Trump administration has another 4 years of governance to do. Europe in this time period should not be relying on the United States for support. One thing that me and Trump agree on, although for completely different reasons, is that European states have relied too heavily on the military and defense spending of the US rather than developing their own collective security architecture. Ultimately, Trump believes that that is the case because he believes that the US is unfairly footing the bill for Europe. I believe that it is the case because Europe can't rely anymore on the United States. Okay, this is something that European leaders in the past have said. So various different leaders, the former Prime Minister of Germany, for example, the former Chancellor, sorry, should I say, of Germany, has said that in the previous Trump administration. And so when we think about the work of the Trump administration now and for the next 4 years, the European family should focus inward with the assumption that the United States can no longer be relied upon as an ally. This is a major step. And it's actually a very sad thing to have to say, because, of course, the special relationship between not just the UK and the United States, as is defined as the special relationship, but more broadly between the continent of Europe and the United States, has been one that has held strong for a long period of time. But in the era of Trump, this is not a relationship that can be relied upon anymore. And as we have seen this be the case. What this involves then is the stepping up of defence spending, especially in countries that have been reluctant to increase their defence spending, like the United Kingdom, for example, like France and like Spain. This has taken place in other countries. Poland, for example, has massively increased their defence spending, so too has Germany. And ultimately, what this is pointing to is the fact that Trump has shown a clear disregard for international community, and for global community, and for global internationalism, especially with his threats to acquire territory from of the territory of Greenland from Denmark, for example, or his disregard for international law with reference to ethnically cleansing the Gaza Strip and turning it into a, quote, Riviera of the Middle East. All of these things are, of course, a complete destruction of international law and international relations and international community. And I've spoken about Trump's Gaza plan in the previous episode that was done yesterday, ultimately. So for the time being, the US should not be seen as an ally that Europe can rely upon, because the US clearly has not shown that it is able to step up in these situations and provide support in a time when support is most heavily needed upon. So Europe should look inwards, as I've said, and Europe should collectively develop its own security architecture that does not require the United States, with the assumption that the United States is not part of this community anymore. This might change in the future. Trump's foreign policy aggression against places like Denmark and his clear flaunting of international law might change over the years. We don't know. He might just go and play some golf again like he did in his last administration. We'll have to see in the future. I'd like to hope that this sort of first couple of months of his administration is the point at which he sort of makes the boldest claims and makes the boldest attempts to do the things that he wants to do, and that eventually when he gets sort of caught up in the litigation of the separation of powers in the United States and checks and balances, and he realizes that he can't just rule by decree through executive order, that he is able to essentially wind down some of these quite aggressive actions. We'll see. We'll see if this changes, if he calms down a bit, or if we get this for another 4 years, in which case there's going to be a lot of Eustachian videos that are going to be made. The final point I want to make is just the conclusion about a point that, and an argument that is seen by many as compelling. And this is the idea of the threat of nuclear weapons, or that the idea that the threat of the use of nuclear weapons would or should outweigh the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine. And that, in other words, by poking the bear, so to speak, i.e. by poking the bear in the sense of sort of provoking Russia, we risk nuclear holocaust. Now, I can understand why this is an argument that is compelling for some, but I reject this argument for a number of reasons. The first reason is that I know, and everybody else should know, that Putin is not stupid. He has threatened the use of nuclear weapons, I believe, over 40 times since the invasion began in 2022. There's a geopolitical expert, I believe, expert on who speaks quite a lot on the Times Radio, who mentioned that he has tracked essentially every single time there's the threat of nuclear weapons by Putin, and I believe it's about 40 or so times, or 40 or so red lines, alleged red lines that the West has crossed over that apparently are red lines that would cause nuclear weapons to be used. And at no point have these nuclear weapons been used, of course. He knows then, Putin knows that such a move would risk the complete collapse of all of the very limited soft power that the Russian Federation still has. It would galvanize support against the Russian Federation more so than already has taken place, especially from places like China, who definitely would not want to see another nuclear armed state using nuclear weapons or threatening the use of nuclear weapons on their border. They've already got quite a few nuclear states surrounding their geographical territory. Additionally, if the worst were to happen and Putin were to use nuclear weapons against Europe, the Russian Federation would obviously come off worse in this situation. And the Russian military has been shown to be a bit of a paper tiger over the past few years. The common joke is that over the last 30 years, the Russian military, or the ex-Soviet military, has become from being the second most powerful military in the world to now the second most powerful military in Ukraine. And that has been shown. The line has barely moved. The might of Ukraine, in fact, but the might of the Russian Federation, the alleged might of the Russian Federation, has been shown to be nothing more than a paper tiger. Given the fact that many geopolitical experts and analysts and military experts believed that when this build-up of threat of use of force in on the border of Ukraine back in early 2022 was started to take place, they believed that Ukraine would collapse within a matter of days or within a matter of weeks. The Russian Federation themselves believed that this would take place, with famously the convoy going all the way to Kyiv. This has not happened. We are now years into this war, and they have barely taken any more territory than they did at the very start of this conflict. And so ultimately, we can see that the threat and the might of the Russian military is clearly not as strong as we all once thought it was. And then the common adage again is that since the Ukrainian invasion of Kursk, the Kursk region, the Russian military has gone from being the second most powerful military in the world to the second most powerful military in Ukraine to now the second most powerful military in Russia. So again, all of these are quite funny points to make, but ultimately they underlie a very serious point that the threat of use of force against the Russian military is clearly not as strong as it was was from the Cold War, for example, where our perceptions of the Cold War, our perceptions of the Russian military might have not changed since the Cold War, but the actual strength of the Russian military clearly has. And then the final point on the nuclear threat is the one that I want to really, really hammer home. And this is the point, and it's a point that I believe Timothy Snyder has also made in the past, which is the fact that Russia and Putin cannot be allowed to get their own way by the mere fact of just brandishing the threat of nuclear weapons. They can't just be able to acquire territory by the use of force unlawfully by threatening nuclear weapons, by brandishing nuclear weapons. This would signal to third states that they need to do one of two things. They would either have to join NATO and become part of the nuclear umbrella that this provides, or develop their own nuclear weapons program in order to protect themselves against outside threats. So essentially, this signals to other states that they have to basically arm up and become nuclear states themselves in order to protect themselves against aggressive actors and aggressive states in places like in places where Russia might invade in the future. This also signals, by the way, the prohibition on the use of force, the protection of that basic fundamental use, Kogan's obligation in international law against other states. So states like China, and with their eyes on trying to eventually launch military operations against Taiwan. This signals to them that that would come at great risk, and that will come at great risk to China as well in terms of conflict with the Chinese state. So all of these things are really, really important, and they go beyond just Russia and Ukraine. They go and they are geopolitical and global in nature. And so really finishing this episode, I would just say that keep an eye on the news, keep an eye on what's happening, keep an eye on what will happen in Ukraine, because if the US concludes a deal with the Russian Federation to carve up Ukrainian resources, to carve up Ukrainian energy resources, as was leaked by, I believe, The Telegraph. This won't come with Ukraine lying down. It is clear that Ukraine are not going to lie down and just take whatever it is that the Americans and that the Russians want to give. This also means that the European states, the rest of Europe, need to step up. The rest of Europe need to step up and show the clear division that exists now between Europe and the United States. So we will see what happens. Like I said at the start of this episode, that I wasn't planning on making another Use Gentium episode until next week. I was planning on doing something else instead today. But I decided to do this right now because of the fact that in the news it is very prevalent that what is taking place is clearly an unlawful thing that is happening, and another clear violation and degradation of the basic rules of international law by the Trump administration. So if you have any comments, if you have any questions, if you have anything that you want to add, please put that down in the comment section down below. If you have any suggestions for further topics, we don't need to necessarily talk about the Trump administration every single time. I know that I could probably fill as much time as I possibly can thinking about the Trump administration, but we can talk about other things as well. Do let me know in the comments down below. And I hope everybody's enjoyed this episode, and stay tuned for future episodes on various other topics within international law and international relations in the future.